A tiny 4-bar sample in a 90s Britpop anthem sparked one of the most absurd and arguably unjust legal battles in music history. You may think Bittersweet Symphony by the Verve was a simple case of unauthorized sampling from the Rolling Stones, but what actually happened is far more twisted, involving obscure orchestral covers, ruthless publishing rights, and millions in stolen royalties, all for a song the Rolling Stones didn't even write. If you enjoy untangling stories like this, please subscribe for more music history deep dives. Let's rewind to where it all began. London, 1965. The Rolling Stones released The Last Time, a gritty blues-infused single that became their first UK #1 written by Jagger and Richards. It was raw, rhythmic, and unmistakably theirs, or so it seemed. At first listen, it's hard to imagine any link between this track and Bittersweet Symphony. The two songs share no obvious melody or production similarities. That's because the iconic orchestral loop that drives the Verve's hit doesn't come from this original version at all. Around the same time, the Stones' manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, began producing instrumental versions of the band's songs under the name the Andrew Oldham Orchestra. It was a side project intended more as a novelty than a serious musical endeavor. Among the tracks on the 1966 release The Rolling Stones Songbook was a lush, string-heavy cover of The Last Time, slow, cinematic, and largely forgotten for decades. That is, until Richard Ashcroft of the Verve stumbled upon it 30 years later. In the mid-1990s, Richard Ashcroft, lead singer of the Verve, discovered the obscure orchestral cover of The Last Time. Among its dramatic strings, one small section stood out. A 4-bar loop of brooding violins, perfect for the melancholic, swelling sound Ashcroft envisioned. What he didn't find was a hit, he found a fragment, a mood, a moment. And from that moment, he began to build something entirely new. Ashcroft and the rest of the band didn't just drop the loop into a track and call it a day. They layered it, they sculpted it. They brought in composer Will Malone to write new string arrangements, and guitarist Nick McCabe added waves of sound that made the final track feel enormous and emotionally charged. The result was Bittersweet Symphony, a 6-minute meditation on modern life, consumerism, and alienation. As McCabe later said, the sample hardly featured in it at all. The main string line that everybody thinks is the sample is actually Will Malone's score. Despite the heavy lifting done by the band, the Verve knew they needed permission to use the sample. They contacted Decca Records, who owned the recording of the Oldham cover, and struck a deal, a 50-50 royalty split. The band thought they were in the clear. They'd secured the necessary clearance and were preparing for the release of what would become their most iconic track. But as the song's release approached, trouble came knocking. Not from Decca, but from the shadows of the Stones' past. Alan Klein, a former manager of the Rolling Stones from the 1960s, still owned the publishing rights to The Last Time through his company, A.B. Casio. When he learned that a sample of the orchestral version had been used in Bittersweet Symphony, he pounced. And not just on the sample. Klein claimed that the Verve had used more of the orchestral recording than originally agreed upon. But more significantly, he argued that Bittersweet Symphony's vocal melody was also borrowed from the original The Last Time, only slowed down and altered. Was the melody similar? Perhaps, faintly. But in the gray legal landscape of copyright law, Klein had just enough leverage to make a move, and it worked. Despite having cleared the sample, the Verve were dragged into a legal battle they couldn't win. Ashcroft later recalled, "We even knew that we may have the whole publishing taken away from us before we put it on as a single. In the end, they were forced to hand over 100% of the songwriting credit and royalties to Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, despite the two Stones having had zero involvement in writing or recording Bittersweet Symphony." Ashcroft famously joked that Bittersweet Symphony was the best song Jagger and Richards had written in 20 years. Klein had a reputation in the music industry as a cold, relentless businessman. He managed high-profile artists like the Rolling Stones and Sam Cooke, but he often left a trail of resentment behind. His business model was clear: secure publishing rights, then protect them with maximum aggression. Creativity and fairness had little to do with it. It wasn't just the Verve who felt cheated. Andrew Oldham, who produced the orchestral version used in the sample, later sued Klein for additional royalties from commercial use. David Whittaker, the arranger of that version, said, "The whole thing just makes me a bit sick." Even the last time itself wasn't entirely original. The Stones had adapted the chorus and feel from a traditional gospel song by the Staple Singers called "This May Be the Last Time."
This may be my last time, may be my last time, I don't know. Wow.
The song that triggered millions in lawsuits wasn't entirely theirs to begin with. What happened to the Verve is a case study in how the music industry often treats artists. It wasn't Jagger or Richards who initiated the lawsuit. In fact, they stayed out of it entirely. The problem was the business side, the suits, the contracts, the corporations that owned art like property and wielded it like a weapon. As Ashcroft once said,
"In the end, it's not in the Stones' hands, it's in the hand of some guy in a suit in New York City who owns their material. The Bittersweet Symphony, you're a slave to money, then you die. Then some geezer comes and takes all the publishing from it. It's sort of beautiful."
In recent years, the estate of Marvin Gaye sued Ed Sheeran over alleged similarities in melody and rhythm. Like in the Verve's case, it wasn't about artistic theft. It was about publishing rights and money. Gaye wasn't even alive. These cases often have little to do with protecting art and everything to do with exploiting copyright for profit. Alan Klein passed away in 2009. His son, Jody Klein, took over ABKCO and eventually opened the door to a long overdue conversation. He reached out to Jagger and Richards, who, free from Klein's influence, agreed it was time to set things right. In 2019, after more than 20 years, the songwriting credit for Bittersweet Symphony was officially returned to Richard Ashcroft. He also regained the rights to all future royalties. Unfortunately, none of the millions earned from the song's peak years would be returned. But for Ashcroft, it was never just about the money. It was always about the song, he said. "I just wanted it to be mine." The story of Bittersweet Symphony isn't just about a sample. It's about how the music industry turns art into property, and how power, not creativity, often decides who gets the credit. It's about outdated contracts, old grudges, and the slow machinery of justice. But it's also about resilience, about an artist who refused to let go of what he created, even as lawyers and executives stripped it away. In the end, Bittersweet Symphony became what its name suggests: a painful, poetic fight, and finally, a small but meaningful victory.